Most startups need a little bit of cash in the early days, and I was no exception. Back in 2014, 2015, I lived in a 2-bedroom house in the cheapest part of town. We were right at the end of the bus line, and the only reason anybody would go there would be to take their kids to school, or if they lived there. But I had a spare room in my house, and you gotta sweat those assets when times are hard. So my easiest side hustle was to rent out the room. Made all the easier by Airbnb. These were the golden years. I'd already stayed in several Airbnbs myself. I even made friends with some of the hosts. I'll never forget, my favorite ever summer was spent in Los Angeles. I was training at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and every day I had this gorgeous, cozy house. Well, it was a little studio apartment to go back to at the intersection of La Brea and Melrose. And yeah, those of you who know, that is right by the Pink's hot dog stand. But back to my own personal hosting, we were at that stage where I needed to hire other people into the business, which meant only paying me for part-time hours. That itself was not enough. So I brought in a little bit of extra personal money by Airbnb-ing that spare room. I even became a superhost. At that time, that was about the only award I was winning. Honestly, it's actually kind of humbling to see how far I've come since then. My name is Dr. Becky Sage. I've been a founder multiple times, and now I work with other founders, as well as co-hosting the podcast Founded and Grounded. I am here to demystify what it is to be an entrepreneur and innovator, through which I hope to give you the inspiration that you need to keep going on your entrepreneurial journey. And I hope to be part of that support system that's going to help you along the way. And there is so much useful stuff for us to learn from this very popular, pretty well-known Airbnb startup story. This video will touch on some of the well-known stories of the Y Combinator darling, and also ask if some of those stories are actually myths. I mean, did Airbnb actually get funding with that deck that we all see? Did they use cereal to fund their business in the early days? Keep watching, I'll let you know. Because Airbnb stories these days seem to be as well known as Disney fairy tales. But I want to look beyond that and ask, what can we learn? We no longer live in those halcyon years of Airbnb, who went from 3 roommates unable to pay their rent to a $127 billion valuation of the company. Travelers, hosts, team members, all have positive stories about Airbnb, but you know there are horror stories too. And as an Airbnb superhost, I do have some of my own horror stories, which I will share later on. But overall, I have had really good experiences, and I've had whole new experiences opened up because I've been able to stay at Airbnbs, because I've been able to go to new cities for months at a time at a rate that was actually affordable. But as a traveler, I rarely use Airbnb now. Costs can be prohibitively high, especially for places that feel safe enough for people traveling alone. Many people have been against Airbnb because of the role it has played in making affordable housing unavailable in cities. And even this year, many hosts boycotted Airbnb because of one of the founders' political views. But if it wasn't for Airbnb, I wouldn't have had the money to pay my bills. And I wouldn't have made some amazing connections, including my first ever guest, who was a sweet young woman. She was contemplating what to do after her master's and doing a bit of traveling. We went out for walks in the local countryside, and she even bought me this mug, which I still have 10 years later. I'm finally following that advice. Then there was the 19-year-old German boy who was an engineering trainee. He actually ended up interning in my business. So Airbnb helped me out in more ways than one. And then there was the Aussie divorcee. She used to take the bus all the way to the other end of the line, 90 minutes. And what was at the end? Just a generic shopping mall. No matter how many times I told her that it would be much more interesting if she got off in the center of the city, she just enjoyed the comfort of that journey and the mall. She knew what she was going to get, and she wasn't going to get rained on, which of course is always a risk in Bristol. And I'm not the only one who has these kind of amazing stories of connection. So on the surface, this seems very much like there is some love and there is some hate for the brand. But is it Marmite? Let's jump in to find out more. At the origin of Airbnb is a story not dissimilar to mine. Someone who was looking for a way to pay their bills. Only I didn't invent the platform and didn't become a billionaire. Other than that, our stories are basically the same. So as one of the founders, Joe Gebbia, describes, this all started when their landlord hiked the rent by 25%. In a letter that he posted when he actually left the business, he said, "I couldn't believe my eyes. My heart began to race. The letter addressed from my landlord trembled in my hands. I read it again to be certain. Yep, not an illusion. He was raising the rent for our walk-up apartment in Rouse Street, San Francisco, by $1,050 a month. Where does he expect us to find this kind of money?" was all that I could muster. Nate, my roommate, nodded in similar disbelief and soon moved out. My friend Brian optimistically moved in, and then the stress hit him too. So Joe, alongside Jet Fuel Chesky and Indiana Nate, as he describes them, needed to act quick. Brian's optimism is going to be a theme that you hear about all the way through this video. After Nate had left, he drove from LA to San Francisco, and it was only when he got there that he realized just how dire the circumstances were. He knew they had to find money quickly. Joe and Brian both had a design background, and they knew that there was an upcoming design conference. So they decided to post their room for people looking for somewhere to stay for this conference. It needed to be more affordable and more available than all of the hotel rooms throughout the city. But they didn't have any spare beds. What they had was air beds. They were offering air, bed and breakfast. Air bed and breakfast. After posting on blogs and forums, they attracted 3 people in to stay with them, giving a small and temporary boost to their financial situation. But they also made some new friends, one of which invited them to their wedding. While this hadn't solved everything, it had planted the seed of the idea. So they continued to focus their idea around temporary accommodation. They asked themselves if they could turn this into something more. They brought Nate back into the fold. I believe he'd been in Boston for a little while at this point, as he was the technical guy. And they created an online directory that focused around big events. They listed homes that could be rented temporarily, that had a spare airbed, and they put the phone numbers in the directory. That's as far as it went. According to Nate, it was just like Craigslist. And they decided to launch this version of Air, Bed and Breakfast at South by Southwest in 2008. This had been the place where Twitter had launched very successfully just 1 year before. The lore goes that they convinced about 12 people to list their homes, and about 3 people booked. One of those people was Brian Chesky. So Brian flew down to Austin, Texas, and went through the experience himself, something we call eating our own dog food. Remember that for later. He had great hospitality from his hosts, but the payment side was a little bit more of an issue. With cash being the only option at the time, he kept struggling to make it to the ATM, and the hosts began to lose some of their trust in him. They knew at this point that it's going to be vital to build the payment system into Airbnb so that the hosts could focus on hospitality and creating connection. This all ultimately led them to the big launch. They figured that many people would be heading for the DNC in 2008. There was a lot of buzz around this event because this was when Obama was going to get nominated as the presidential candidate for the Democrats. Far more people would be descending on Denver for that event than they had rooms to be able to cope with. So Airbnb managed to sign up 800 hosts and get 100 bookings. They were on a high. But that high did not last very long. They very quickly entered the trough of sorrows, as Brian describes it. Just because the launch was exciting, even leading to a CNN interview, within a week, they were irrelevant again. They needed finance and they needed publicity. So what does anybody do when they need finance and publicity? They create cereal boxes, of course. Now, Obama O's and Captain McCain's are the cereals that you may have heard of already. The team at Airbnb created boxes. They designed and got these boxes printed out, and then they went and bought cereals from off the shelf and filled up these boxes. This initially was purely for publicity, so they sent these boxes out to journalists, and it got attention. Yet again, they appeared on CNN. This led to these cereal boxes being in demand. They popped them on their website and sold about $30,000 worth of cereal. While that money was great, it was not going to last very long. In fact, Nate says that it barely did more than cover the costs of making these cereals in the first place. So is the myth real that they use cereal to fund the business? Not directly. What they really used the cereal for was to get attention. So they still needed investment. And that's what we'll talk about in the next section. So what worked in these early stages of Airbnb? Can we learn from it? Would it still be helpful now? Airbnb launched during 2008. Now you probably recall that 2008 included a huge financial crash and a recession afterwards. So it was a difficult time for many. But perhaps this helped for Airbnb. People were needing to sweat the assets they already had. Perhaps this led to more hosts wanting to make that extra cash and more travelers wanting to pay more affordable prices. Now, while this isn't something we can fully learn from, because these are external factors, we can't control those uncontrollables, but we can take the lesson to control the controllables. Still push forward and innovate. So, as with some of the other videos I've talked about, the founding team already knew each other. Brian and Joe had done several things together over the years. They'd actually been at college, which was the Rhode Island School of Design. But they also had amazing complementary skills and personalities by the sounds of it. We had Nate. He was technical. He has an amazing background. Not only was he a Harvard graduate, he had experience in building apps. And so his skills meant that they could build the platform using just the skills within that founding team. Brian really brought this now renowned ability to stay optimistic, to focus, and to action any task. He, of course, also brought his design skills. And design is such an important thing when you are creating a startup. We'll go on to that in a moment. Joe also brought those design skills with him. But yeah, he had an amazing intersection of art and entrepreneurship. He discusses in a podcast that I was listening to that he used to sketch ideas and then bring them to life. It's like he manifests from his art. He talked about always pursuing the thing that felt right. And he'd been very entrepreneurial since his teens. I have to say, this whole team is a very similar age to me. So back in the 90s when he was growing up, he was teaching himself CSS and HTML, as was I actually. So it's very interesting. It's kind of rather nostalgic to look back on that. But I really didn't have any idea about business or entrepreneurship when I was in my teens. Something I often ask myself when I'm looking at other founders' stories is, could I do what they did? They couldn't afford to pay their rent, but they got to South by Southwest. How did they convince people to post their homes when they were a completely unknown, unproven quantity? How did they have enough energy to do this as a side hustle? Because that is what they were doing. Were they spending money they didn't have? What was their appetite for risk? I believe it was relatively high. Brian talks a lot about acting on instinct. And whilst I am naturally very instinctively driven, I sometimes find that my need for a kind of safety blanket overrides my instincts. Have you ever had an idea that you feel like you could just push and push and push until it came into fruition? Because essentially that's what this team did. Now, I mentioned earlier the term eating your own dog food. This was something I first learned from my CTO in my first business. Dog fooding is using your own products so you understand from the inside out what the experience is for your customers. Brian staying in that Airbnb at South by Southwest was an example of that. They'd also been on the host side because that's what they'd done when the design conference came to San Francisco. Good question, do you eat your own dog food in your business? Sports, design and art all played a really big part in the founding of this business. Sports more in the personalities of the founding team, but design and art really found their way into the Airbnb business. And I think that these three things were really magic components here. Sports brings team, community, personal growth, discipline and a competitive spirit. Joe talked about, as a young basketball player, being told, if you want to get better, play with people who are better than you. And he reflected this in the team they built at Airbnb and in the people that they had around them. At this point in time, there was also so much respect for design. At that time, I was actually working on a project that collaborated with the Design Council here in the UK. And I really didn't fully understand at that point in time the importance of design thinking for business. But by the time I got to my own startup, I was really integrating it. And now with perspective, I see how valuable that was. And I actually see that we've lost a lot of that. And it's really apparent in a lot of the businesses and the founders that they are not thinking with design thinking. I think that through thinking like a designer, or even like an artist, we can really embed the humanity into business. And yes, I do think that's even more important now that AI is taking over. Then the final point I want to make here in terms of lessons learned, the value of PR and hustle. Being a serial entrepreneur, serial with a C, is one of the values at Airbnb now, and it comes from that original piece of thinking they were doing when they launched those cereal boxes. Would this work now? I actually think businesses need to be focusing more on this kind of thing now. I think we've lost this art of making a splash, of doing something creative, doing something slightly different, doing something to get noticed. Now, I fully appreciate that as I sit here and talk on YouTube, it might feel like everybody is just doing something to get noticed. But actually, most of the businesses I see, most of the businesses I work with, they're excellent at getting their head down and getting the job done in a very rational, a very logical way. But we also need some space for that creativity. And I have to say, those creative aspects not only get you noticed, they also make running a business fun. Everyone is playing it so safe right now. What would it mean to do things a little bit more boldly, a little bit more creatively? That type of thinking, that type of personality and human ingenuity is being replaced by AI slop. Now, we talk about content that way, but we don't want our businesses to be AI slop too, do we? AI slop online is getting less and less tolerated. So perhaps everyone's ready for more personality in business again. We also have to remember that having your head down incessantly, especially if it's alongside AI tools, really isn't very healthy. Burnout is absolutely prolific, particularly for those who hole up in rooms with a team of AIs and nobody else. How will you tap back into your creative self? Let me know in the comments. So during 2008, Airbnb failed to raise money despite being in the heart of Silicon Valley. They achieved meetings but weren't always successful. The founders even recount a story of an investor that just got up and walked out in the middle of a meeting. They were in a coffee shop and they thought he'd just gone out to load the parking meter, but he never came back. But in 2009, that story changed. And there's a very famous pitch deck that often does the rounds in entrepreneurial teaching circles. Yeah, that's the kind of exciting circles I'm in, you know. Would this deck work well today? Well, let's have a look. One second, I'm just going to share my screen. So here is our title slide. This clearly says what we do for the end user. And also here at the bottom, you can see that there are details. They're very small, but they're clear. If someone sees this and they like it, they can find you. And one thing that's not on here that I always get my founders to talk to the lawyers about is a disclaimer on the front. And if you want to know more about that, let me know in the comments below. Next slide, please. The problem side, written from the end user's perspective, not the host's perspective, interestingly. And again, this is very simple. They've kept it at a very high level, it's understandable. They've put certain words in bold so we remember those words, price tell. And they also remind us that this doesn't currently exist. So their differentiator is clear. One thing I was thinking was quite interesting when I was looking at this deck is that you need to remember that this team has an art and design background. They could design incredibly opulent slides. But I think one thing that they've realized, and a message I often get when I'm talking to investors, is that they don't want busy slides. They don't need over-the-top slides. They need it to be clear, concise, understandable, and compelling, of course. They don't need more colors, more graphics. The words do the job. Good design doesn't mean lots of fancy art. It means being effective and efficient, function and form. Now I've got lots of questions that are already starting to arise as I start to look at this deck at this point, and I will tackle some more of them as I go through. But remember, a deck is designed to compel people to book the next meeting. That's when they'll ask more questions. Next slide, solution. Again, very simple and clear. We know what they do. They're starting to lightly address the fact they have a multi-sided market by establishing the vocabulary of the host and establishing that one of their core principles, which is about creating connections. Market validation. So they've used the Couchsurfing and Craigslist numbers to show that there is a market, people are doing this. But why do people use Airbnb? Perhaps this is answered later on in the deck. Also, what's the issue with these current solutions? I feel like maybe they could have been a bit cleaner with some of this. They then go on to the market size slide, so next slide. A lot of the founders I work with, and actually myself included, have really struggled with TAM, SAM, and SOM. We, especially as scientists and technologists, try to be incredibly logical with it and want to create something very literal, but at the same time we see a lot of other people do it. We see things like this deck and go, gosh, that's incredibly simple. How do we create that simplicity? It's actually really quite difficult. One of the challenges that innovative companies have is they're often maybe creating new markets or working with slices of a market that are being sliced in a different way from normal, that kind of thing. So you have to make estimates. The investors I talk to say, just have a good rationale. You just need to show that you're thinking about this smartly, and we need to know that there is a plausible market here for you to grow into. And the size of that market is big enough for us to get our ROI. Here in this deck, we do see some really clear facts. 2 billion trips booked worldwide. And this is interesting because some might say, oh, but is that your TAM? Because are you competing with every single trip booked worldwide? Like, is everyone potentially a customer for you? And actually, yes, potentially, right? It's never going to be, but there is potential for that. It's not like they've used the budget for the entire hospitality industry. And that's why they can justifiably present this number. They've then segmented just the budget and online bookings, and that's their SAM, a figure that I'm sure has changed substantially over the years since 2009. But this is an interesting way to slice the pie and is particularly relevant for them. It might not work the same now because there's very, very few people who book trips online. They have rather arbitrarily suggested that they can capture 15% of the market, but I'd like to know more about what that means. They would need to show, if they were doing this now, they would need to show some kind of justification of why they've chosen 15%. Next slide is about the product. This is fine, great, clear, but what I think is missing is any data related to the product. What makes it different? What makes it defensible? Does it already work? Like maybe they'll talk about traction later on. Nowadays, of course, a video might also be more effective on this slide, but I would want to understand better kind of, yes, this is the vision. Does it already exist? Although most of the companies I work with would, especially if they're at a very early stage, would probably put that into like some kind of roadmap. Okay, next slide, the business slide. What I really like about this is that they've continued that thread from the SOM. So they said we're taking 15%. Okay, if we're taking 15%, what does that look like in terms of our business model and how much money we can make? This is something else that people often get tied up with. They haven't used dollars in the market sizing, which because of the way they've done this slide, I think is okay. And actually this is quite a neat way to show that bottom up potential of the business, potential revenue. Now, when I first looked at this, it took me a little while to make it make sense. And I don't know if anyone else has had the same things as me. There's a glaring mistake on here. Did you get it? 84 million trips is their 15%. Or their SOM number. It's about trips. It's not about a dollar amount. But they've put $84 million on here. It took me like, what? I don't understand what they're saying here. Does this work out? I figured it out. Also, another random thing here. Why have they used $80 per night as their average if the actual average is currently $70 a night? I don't mind that they're using that, but just tell me why. And this says that they were going to make 2.1 billion based off these numbers by 2011. Did they do that? It's been estimated that they made about 40 million in 2011, which still, you know, pretty good going. Fun fact, when Nate went through an early version of the deck, maybe not this one, but it could be this one, he said that the projected figures of 200 million didn't make sense. They were too high. So they agreed as a team to change them to 20 million. The next day, they went to an investor meeting and they had changed the deck, but they changed it to 2 billion, which is obviously the forecast that's here. So I wonder if that was the same one. I also wonder if I could have coped with that if I was Nate. I am learning how these things work. I've known them in my head for a long time. There is something very interesting about this inherent nature of basically overestimating in order to attract what you need, in order to build something that's not going to hit those targets, but ultimately in the end is going to do way better than those targets. Like, this is how business actually works. We say it's about rational and logical, but actually it's about big vision too. And what is your best way of describing that big vision? It's a difficult balance though, and you can't be fraudulent. You've just got to make assumptions at this stage and then justify those assumptions. Next slide, the adoption strategy. I don't mind this slide, and I quite like having an adoption strategy slide, but it's not really got any context with it. I think it makes sense in hindsight, knowing their story, and of course, like just throwing in these high-level approaches, sure. But I'd like to understand a bit better why these approaches work for this business. And I actually think this would be a real opportunity for them to bring in more of the creative aspects of what they do, like the cereal stuff. Another fun fact, when they did their Y Combinator interview, apparently it didn't really go very well. They were about to leave, and I believe it was Joe, maybe Brian, pulled a cereal box, one of their Obama O's boxes, out of his bag and gave it to the person who was interviewing them at Y Combinator. That's what got them a place. They told them the story behind it, and that hustle and that creativity is what impressed. Next slide. Competition. Again, we've got the key factors of online and offline bookings, which again probably wouldn't be one of the one of the axes these days. Although it might be, but it would just be probably going the other way. If you were going to do something these days that was different and differentiated from what's out there, maybe it would be something that was more bespoke, more face-to-face, more about a premium experience for your customers. And one thing that's really interesting is markets become more and more complex. Of course, we're a couple of decades along now. It feels like everything exists. It feels like everything's more complex. And it can be really quite difficult to find how you position yourself in the competitive landscape. There's lots of different ways you can slice that pie, so to speak. Okay, next slide. We finally get to the competitive advantage slide. Honestly, I'd like to have seen some of this a little earlier, although I see how it makes sense putting it after the competition slide. I don't always like competitions in main decks, and I mean, that's just a personal preference, because I think you need, I prefer the chart ones usually. I do want to know who are the competitors in the space, but really importantly, how are you differentiating yourself for them? So, you know, I like the matrices of competitors rather than those competitive landscape graphs. I think they tell you more. What I'd have really liked here is to kind of start to cover some of those risks that hosts or guests might have. And again, this is where they can differentiate themselves from things like Craigslist. Now, they may not have been in the plans at this point in time, but I think it would have made sense to have that even if it was a visionary thing. The payment side is also a differentiator. Obviously, we discussed that earlier. Brian discovered that for himself. I do think first to market is very key, and I think there is a sense, especially at this point in time, of for investors, act now, you'll get a massive return. If we wait, other competitors will have entered the market. And actually, I think for all of us, Airbnb stands out because it is the first to market. We know there's other similar things that exist, but nothing as high profile as Airbnb. Okay, team slide. Okay, this is fine. I don't think it would be very strong in today's market. And I think that the focus on academic credentials, and those academic credentials really only being undergraduate, I don't think that that would hold much weight at all, really. They also haven't addressed the gaps. What stands out to me in this is Joe's pattern and Nate's app building background, including the 75K. I think that many users and having experience of building something and taking it to that many users would be good experience to have in a deck at this stage for a business. What I was thinking about as I was reading this was how difficult it is in slides to get the team slide right and to use the team slide to capture the things that are actually going to make a difference to this business. So many people say that in Airbnb, it's Brian's leadership, his character traits, that really drove the business forward and that continues to drive the business forward. But if we look at it on this slide, he really adds very little. Like, you could take him out and probably still have just as much value on this slide. This topic comes up a lot when I talk to investors. They really want to figure out how can we judge that quality, the type of quality that Brian has. And it's something I've been looking into a lot over the years because I think it's really about leadership characteristics. And I think that we can write down a lot of those things. They have added in an advisor, a tiny little advisor here. I don't know why it's so small. And Michael Seibel, incidentally now a partner at Y Combinator, when he was the one that recommended them to Y Combinator. Then we've got press slide. Now this is quite interesting because it shows there has been some press, but it doesn't add that much and it doesn't feel that compelling. And I think it probably could have gone onto the same page as the next slide, which is testimonials. Airbed and breakfast freaking rocks. Okay, I feel like this is the kind of testimonial I would have put in at one time. I think it's short, which is always good on a slide deck. And it may also represent something that was really exciting, a guest that you're like, oh, that person actually said that, that's awesome. I'd like to see a little more from like the guest side, the host side, what are those experiences? And I think seeing this slide for me really opened up my eyes to how early the business was at this stage. I think testimonials are really great, but I think they have to highlight your differentiators or highlight some core value that you bring. But I also think testimonials are really great for tackling common risks. For example, something that talked about feeling safe could tackle the idea that Airbnb is less creepy than Craigslist. Okay, next slide, please. This is the financials, or at least that's what they're calling it. I would actually call this the ask slide, because this is what they're asking for from their investors. I would also expect to see a little more of a financial slide. In addition to this, and prior to this slide, I would expect to see a financial forecast with any key assumptions in that forecast. What I do like about this slide is that the metrics are very clear, but I want to know, how are they going to get to 80K? Where are they right now? And what is the kind of headline use of funds? So overall, this is like a clear deck. The proposition is clear, but there is not enough evidence of traction. And I don't think there's enough of an indication of the key principles that sit behind the business. Perhaps they didn't exist yet. The investors I know would probably say to this deck, if it fit their thesis, okay, we'll keep an eye on it, but they kind of need to go away and do a little bit more work for us to take it seriously. Personally, I really love the simple style of this deck, but I do feel like there's a bit of the key Airbnb ingredients missing. Again, this may not have existed yet, although they had already done the cereals. How could they have been more serial entrepreneur in this deck? I always like to see roadmaps in decks, and I actually like them to show the story so far and the direction of travel. And I think maybe this would have been helpful in this deck. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you think there was anything else missing? So at this point, they'd built a product, they'd got CNN coverage, they had got to know some customer behavior, but did it actually work? Let's find out. So the deck you've just seen was from 2009, and in that year they did achieve over $600,000 in funding. Now apparently when they first went in and did their Y Combinator interview, and Y Combinator was one of the early investors, they didn't initially do very well. Right at the end of the meeting, I think it was Joe pulled out a cereal box, one of their Obama's O's, and gave it to the Y Combinator team. It was that moment that they actually showed off what they can do and that got them a place on Y Combinator. And this is where they really learned some more lessons that kickstarted their investment journey. So first of all, one of the things they were asked was, where are most of your users? And it was New York. So they said, however you can, whatever means, get yourself to New York and find out more about your customers. And so they really did. During that time, they went out to New York and they spoke to so many more people. They got to understand what the experience was that those customers were having, and therefore they were able to build a better product. During this time, a few quotes got established that many founders absolutely hang on these days. One was, it's better to have 100 who love you than 1,000 who like you. And I do believe that that still stands really, really true, again, especially in these early days. And the other thing they were told was it's okay to do things that don't scale in these early days. So one of the things that they realized when they went to New York was that hosts weren't actually very good at doing good pictures, and guests were making a decision based on the pictures that they were seeing. So the better the photos, the more likely somebody was to book. What they were able to do was get professional photographers, and I do believe the professional photographers initially were Brian and Joe, to come in, take photos, and those photos were a lot better than those hosts might have been able to do for themselves. They did this free of charge for their hosts because at this stage, they didn't need that to scale. Of course, it probably wouldn't have scaled very effectively, but they needed more users, more hosts, more bookings, more travelers. So I think, again, and for me, a lot of this comes back to the creativity, the design side of things. How are you really going to make a small number of people love you? And even if that does take something that isn't ultimately going to scale, but it might be enough to seed your business, or at least seed future funding. So let's talk funding. Initially, they got $20,000 from Y Combinator, for which they gave away 6%. Officially, that date was November 2008, but they started the cohort in January of 2009. So I guess it was around about that time. Then in April, so this would have been once they've gone through that winter cohort, they'll have done demo day for Y Combinator. They'd found out this extra information. They'd done better postings, so they're starting to get a bit more buzz around what they're doing. And they were able to do a seed round of 615,000. I believe that this was an advanced subscription or a convertible note, something along those lines, because I can't find a valuation for the business at this point in time. 18 months later, November 2010, they did a seed round of 5 million with a pre-money valuation of 42 million. These numbers are now in pounds because that's the sources I use have them in pounds. And at this point, they'd booked 700,000 nights in an Airbnb, and 80% of that had occurred in the past 6 months. So they'd shown this massive growth. And by February 2011, Airbnb had hit 1 million bookings. In July 2011, they did an investment round of 70 million with a pre-money valuation of 738 million. And this again reflects even more growth. Airbnb was really quite prolific 2010, 2011. Now they'd hit their first 1 million bookings at the beginning of 2011. It got to 4 million bookings by the end of 2011. So again, this massive growth. In February 2012, they raised 3.2 million, which wasn't much, just a little top up compared to that last round. And then in February 2013, they raised 128 million with a pre-money valuation of 1.48 billion. So the company had become a unicorn. Not bad given that pitch deck we saw from 2009. Now it's interesting, they were starting to do things like patents granted in 2013, such as one that was to do with identification and trustworthiness. So they're addressing what we were talking about before in terms of risk and safety. And then in 2014, they did another round of 277 million at a 5.57 billion valuation. So the value of the company had jumped up again in just over a year from 1.48 billion to 5.57 billion. The next year, no, not even the next year. Later that year, they had a top up 30.72 million. So just like keep getting money in and in and in. Another patent in 2015, and they do have quite a few that are listed. I'm just picking out a few bits and pieces here on determining the trustworthiness of and compatibility of a person. On the 20th of November 2015, they closed a round for 1.05 billion for a valuation of 15 billion. We know at this time that they had a revenue of 0.91 billion. I think in 2015 they were still loss-making, but then in 2016 they started to turn a profit. In 2016 they raised 690 million of debt financing. Their revenue went up to 1.65 billion. In September 2017 they raised 775 million at a valuation of 23 billion. I know, like, how can all of this kind of sound... They did so much investment, it's like getting a little bit boring now. I'm sure it wasn't boring for the founders. I'm sure it was exhilarating. At that point, they had a revenue of 2.56 billion. October 2018, they raised 3.22 billion. At this point, they had a revenue of 3.65 billion. And then honestly, I kind of told you enough, but anyway, I'm just going to keep going. In July of 2019, they raised a very modest 15 million. September 2019, they raised another 11 million, and that was on a valuation of 31 billion. And by now, so that's September 2019, by then, they were bringing in 4.8 billion. And actually, I'm just confusing you here, because some of this is in pounds and some of this is in dollars. So these revenues are in dollars. The reason I didn't want to convert was because I don't know the conversion rates at that time. So I just want to give you the facts that I actually have. And then January 2020. What a blissful life they were leading then. They raised another 3.98 million. By April 2020, the bliss was gone. They were no longer profitable. Everyone was in lockdown. Nobody's doing any kind of travel. I will come back to what they did and how they got through COVID a little bit later in this video, because it's what they describe as a defining moment as a business. So their revenue had dropped quite substantially by this point, and they raised 1.6 billion, but their valuation was 13 billion. Now that's a third or less than a half of what it was just 6 months before. Now they'd planned to actually do an IPO in August of that year. That got pushed back to December of 2020. And during their IPO, they raised 2.6 billion. I will talk about their IPO a little bit more later. They have brought in a tiny bit more money since, 1.39 million in debt financing. So that investment journey is a really long story. The total raised was 7.27 billion pounds. A few interesting things here. Airbnb was one of the tech businesses that Ashton Kutcher invested in. He put 2.5 million in Airbnb in 2011. And apparently that grew to be worth 90 million. So they've certainly helped him out, especially now he's kind of cancelled. Sequoia Capital are thought to have made 12 to 15 billion through Airbnb. They were in right at the beginning, and right now they still hold 14% of the company. So Sequoia and Airbnb like this. And then the data I have says that at IPO, Brian Chesky had 15.4%, Joe Gebbia had 14.2%, and Nathan Blekarczyk had 14.2% as well. They all became billionaires overnight, and they are still billionaires now. So Sequoia were with them all along the way, and I just thought it was quite interesting to hear from Mike Vernal, who was a general partner at Sequoia. He said that the kind of businesses that they like to work with know exactly what they're doing, and they can communicate it concisely. You can't know at the beginning whether a company is going to endure. It's going to take 8 to 10 years. You start with your initial gut feeling, and then you build on that with the rationale. He's looking for people who are addressing missed opportunities, and they obviously saw that in Airbnb. Now, throughout almost all of this time, Airbnb was bringing in substantial revenues, which were growing and growing and growing, and actually became profitable around about 2016. It was only when COVID came along that things really got bleak. In fact, Brian Chesky described it as a 10-year rocket ship, but then that rocket fell to Earth. The defining moment was COVID. A hospitality brand faced with lockdowns all over the world. This was Airbnb at the beginning of 2020. It was an incredibly difficult time, and Brian Chesky describes it as their defining moment. The pandemic brought global travel to a standstill, and both guests and hosts were initially really unhappy with Airbnb because they were being left out of pocket. What Brian said was, the hardest thing to manage in a crisis is your own psychology. And I'm actually planning to delve into this more, this idea of your own psychology, your mindset, in the next episode of The Undercurrent, which will be coming soon. That you should never make a decision out of fear, and you should model optimistic behavior because it makes you brave. And presumably that means it makes other people around you brave and more optimistic as well. And this is going to make you calmer in a crisis. I'm also somebody who really fully believes and embraces optimism, even though I feel like there's so much pessimism around us sometimes. What they decided at this point was to really focus on what was important, and that was to go back to the basics. Simon Sinek did a great interview with Brian Chesky, and in that he described these 4 principles which he shared with the board at the beginning of COVID. So he was like, this is how we're going to work to try and deal with this problem. The first was to act decisively. So he, as CEO, was kind of being empowered to act decisively, to preserve as much cash as possible, to be heroes and not villains in a crisis. So understand that other people in the world are probably suffering even more, making sure you're not adding to that, and to be in offense, not defense. He increased communication with both the team and the board, doing a weekly Q&A with the team, trying to be as honest as possible, even if that might be hard to hear. And he also had weekly board meetings at this time. They knew they had to simplify the company. They'd, at this point, kind of built up lots and lots of different projects, and they thought, actually, we've got to go through an editing process. And they cut about 70 to 80% of those projects using strict prioritization. And that's something I think that, especially if times get difficult, this is really what we as founders need to be doing. I talk about prioritization all the time for startup founders, but I think that especially if times are really hard. They had to do job cuts. That came from this principle of preserving as much cash as possible. At least the business needs to at least be able to continue, right? So they had to cut about 25% of the workforce. They kind of reduced the layers of management, and then lots of people across the business also took pay cuts. Interestingly, Chesky's salary was only $90,000 in 2020. Of course, he was also a billionaire by that point, but his money wasn't necessarily all liquid. But compared to most tech CEOs, that's like a pretty tiny salary to take home. He does talk about handling layoffs compassionately, and I really think this is such an important lesson to learn. They created an outplacement agency, an alumni directory, and gave people a year of healthcare. So all of these changes made them smaller and more nimble. They were then able to behave more like they had done in those early days. He talks about optimism and action. I mean, this is his MO, right? One thing he did say was that data can disconnect you from your intuition. And I do think that this is correct, actually. I think there's a really hard balance to be made. I'm quite a logical person. I like to be data-driven, but actually you really do need that balance. And I always find in my life, I'm more driven by my intuition, might be because of my human design. Talk to you more about that another day. You're probably like, hang on, logical and rational, and you're talking about human design. I get it, I know. Yeah, data can kind of take you away from what you know to be true. And going back to optimism and action helped him in terms of increasing the intensity of decision making. So during this time, they raised emergency funding that allowed them to override host cancellation policies, issue more than $1 billion in refunds to travelers. They pivoted, they focused more on domestic travel, rural travel, on longer stays. As the pandemic kind of progressed, people were looking for those spaces to go to so they could basically go and lock themselves down in a different place because they didn't need to be going into work. And so all of this allowed them to do that amazing turnaround, which got them to their IPO. So as I said, the IPO was originally scheduled for August 2020. Things obviously didn't go to plan. So eventually everything was finally in place on the 10th of December 2020. Their shares skyrocketed on the first day of trading, rising 113% above their initial listing price. And the valuation of Airbnb jumped all the way up to around $103 billion. $103 billion. Now, of course, this is a massive increase from any of the valuations they'd done in the previous funding rounds. And it also put them above all the major hotel chains. The disruptor had finally disrupted. I really like this video that I saw in the news, which captured Brian Chesky finding out about this valuation in real time during a news interview.
To open right now at $139 a share, which is more than double.
That's the first time I've heard that number. I don't know what else to say. I'm very humbled by it.
But one of the interesting things about this is that Brian says that post-IPO was one of the saddest periods of his life. Despite all three founders becoming multi-billionaires on that day, and despite making some of their investors 5,000x return, honestly, I thought the Slack ROI was big, and that was only 500. And if you want to know more about that, go back to that Slack video that I have done recently, which is an earlier video in this series. Anyway, back to Brian Chesky. He describes that when he was younger, he thought that having a lot of money would kind of attract other people with feelings of adoration, that they would admire the wealth. and that would bring friends and a community. But post-IPO, he realized he'd focused so much on working, and they were still in the midst of kind of several lockdowns, that he realized the whole world was isolated, and in particular, he felt very isolated. It hit him incredibly hard. The money didn't attract people. In fact, working hard to make that money had isolated him from people. And the times he'd made for friends and family in the past, he'd felt guilt because he wasn't working. And I don't know about you, I think that for me, I also feel this, and it goes far beyond. It's not really a guilt, it's more feels like an impossibility. Like, I don't know how people carve out that time to see friends and family regularly, to have social time. And I'm not even building $1 billion business. He said, at the bottom of the mountain, you have hope. But the problem is when you get to the top of the mountain, oftentimes you're at the top by yourself, disconnected. I have to say, like with my autism, when I read this, some people probably aren't going to like me saying this, but I actually love alone time. I'd love to be at the top of that mountain alone, and if I was doing that with a few $1 billion, it would feel even better. Surely once you're a billionaire, you can buy some of your time back. He doesn't want to do that though. He is CEO of this company and he continues to be, and he wants to be. So there is a real tension, a real pull, I think, in a lot of founders. He said that he'd actually by this time built up almost a mentoring relationship with Obama, with Barack Obama, as in President Barack Obama, who'd said to him, "You're connected to your roots and your roots are your past." He described the idea that you should have like 15 friends and you should remain really close to them. And Brian Chesky asked himself, like, okay, I've got 15 people. Would it feel random if I just picked up the phone and called any of those people? And he realized that it would. He couldn't just pick up the phone and call a bunch of people. I can hear like all of Gen Z out there right now being like, yeah, I can't just call a bunch of people either. Hashtag not all Gen Z. And he spoke about Obama. He said, he became a bit of a mentor to me. He questioned why Obama was spending so much time with him and said he still can't figure it out. Maybe it's because he committed $20 million a year to the Obama Foundation? Now, I know, like, one of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing is to create relatability to all of you founders out there or people who might want to do entrepreneurship. And I'm not sure having one of the most respected presidents of all time and one of the most respected people on the planet of our time as your weekly mentor counts as being particularly relatable. So maybe you want to watch some of the other videos I do for some other day-to-day relatable moments. But there is a little bit here that is relatable, and I know that you'll feel this too. I mean, I would say that if I did count my friends, there probably are those 15 people around, friends and family. And could I pick the phone up and call them? And sure, do I? No. So I think about the thing about not having time or energy, or even, and again, this maybe is a neurodivergent thing, but for me, if I'm really focusing on work, like pulling my focus to something social just doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel right. I'd much rather be doing my work. So that part, I think, we can relate to. And I'd love to know in the comments if you're a founder or maybe you're just really into your work, you're really into projects. Is that piece about having, like, prioritizing work over friends and family, is that what you do? What's your reasoning for that? Do you like that? I've got to say, I do like that. For me, part of my purpose in life is to work. And so, of course, I care about those people, but I am going to spend time and energy and focus doing the things that I want to do in my working life. So where are Airbnb now? Over the post-IPO years, the valuation of Airbnb has been a bit all over the place. It has not really hit that peak again. It's definitely dropped down since the initial offering, and it's worth about half of as much as the initial listing now. And since 2020, there have been many, many moments where there have been significant fluctuations in the company's value. But revenue has continued to go up since 2022, from 7.9 billion to 8.7 billion to 9.1 billion in 2023, 2024 and 25 respectively. And they have gross margins of approximately 83%. Their EBITDA has been 1 billion, 2 billion, 2 billion over those 3 years as well. So they've been profitable in that time. So any valuations on the stock market do actually reflect their profitability and this increasing revenue, which is perhaps more than can be said for some other businesses out there. Even though when they first went public, they had this valuation that was massive compared to the hotel chains, they now are in the same ballpark. Hilton is at $63.8 billion. And I think this is a particularly interesting one because back in, I think, 2011, there was an article that said Airbnb could have more rooms than Hilton by 2012. And they absolutely did. In fact, by 2017, they had more rooms than all of the major hotel chains combined. They now have 7,300 employees and have continued to develop their IP, getting more patents. And then they've also done several acquisitions over the years. I haven't really had time to delve in and talk all about those ones. Okay, sorry if things are a little different. I've had to change my camera. Anyway, where were we? Acquisitions is definitely a strategy that Airbnb have had over, like, almost right the way back to the beginning. At one time, Brian spoke about an acquisition that they didn't do with somebody who was a competitor that was growing very, very quickly, but that didn't share their values. And that says something about the type of acquisition strategy that they had. So 2 of the 3 founders are still executives in the company, Brian and Nate. They continue to work day to day on Airbnb. Joe left in 2022, but is still on the board. Both Nate and Brian have publicly discussed that they still like to let their houses on Airbnb. So they are still eating their own dog food. They know the host experience. And Brian has said he doesn't think there is going to be a need even for discussions on succession planning, at least not for another couple of decades. He's 44 now. And he thinks that maybe in his 60s he will let somebody else take the reins. He's been doing this since he was 26. Can somebody tell me where this man gets his stamina? Oh yeah, he runs a really successful billion-dollar company. I think that would give me stamina too. It's nothing like seeing your hard work pay off to give you motivation for more. Now, Joe has become more and more distant from Airbnb. I already mentioned that earlier this year, many hosts started to boycott Airbnb because of Joe Gebbia. And this is because he joined the Doge team alongside Elon Musk. Now, he's actually lasted longer than Elon Musk at the White House. He's now been appointed America's first Chief Design Officer to improve experience of public services. Now, I actually really like this premise. I think that this could work incredibly well. It's something we've talked about here in the UK. Things have got to a point where we need to really redesign, and we need to be thinking about things from that user experience. Not so that we can be more efficient in terms of cutting roles, but so that we can create better services with less budget without cutting those really important roles. Now, Joe Gebbia has also been called out by Zoran Mamdani because of tweets he made about immigration. And this specifically goes against many Airbnb activities. In fact, Joe Gebbia had to step down from the board of Airbnb.org because of his public stance on immigration. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the altruistic activities in a minute because they're really, really core to Airbnb. Now, Joe Gebbia was one of the many billionaires who poured money into Cuomo's mayoral campaign for New York, but it wasn't very successful. I guess he spent $2 million on that campaign that he's not getting back. Now, I do wonder how long Gebbia's role in the White House is now going to last, because as of this moment that I'm recording this, apparently Trump has great admiration for Mamdani and doesn't really mind if he calls him a despot or a racist. So we'll see how long Trump is staring longingly into Mamdani's eyes. I'm going to guess it's not going to last all that long. Now, in addition to the founders, who are currently in the top 400 wealthiest people in the world, many, many other people live opulent lives as Airbnb hosts. Not billionaire opulent, but you don't need to be a billionaire to live an incredibly opulent life. Like, there was this couple that I read an article about who now have 12 Airbnbs. They are 12 million in debt, but they get 100 grand a year, and they say they really enjoy living a life of freedom. Let me know in the comments if you think 12 million in debt would feel like freedom to you. But Reddit is also full of crazy horror stories from hosts and from travelers. And in fact, things have actually got really dark with Airbnbs. This one guy in Australia, I believe, killed a guest over something to do with the money. I'm not sure that we can blame Airbnb for somebody who's going to kill somebody else over a couple of $100s. Other things have made people extremely unhappy, like the cleaning fees that hosts were just putting up and up and up, even though there wasn't really a cleaning service. And the price of rooms were going up. And these rooms don't have the same security, safety, or bland cleanliness of a hotel.
If you are Airbnb, I'm going to tell you in real time why no one wants to book with you anymore. And here's why. Okay, here we go. We're going for 2 nights. $73 a night. Perfect, within our budget. So it should be around $150. No, $275 after taxes and all of the fees.
There's also ongoing local policies. Just recently in the budget here in UK, we've added a tourism tax, which is going to impact Airbnb. But the more social complaint is that all the way back, again, right to the beginning of when Airbnb was starting to get used, landlords were starting to shift from long-term tenancies to short-term holiday rentals because it came with more money and less hassle. That then meant more tourists were around, but there was less available housing. Now, I actually have mostly had really good experiences as a host and a guest with Airbnb, but I do have my own horror stories as promised. And so here's my horror stories. They really aren't that bad, but I'll tell you anyway. So there was the one person who didn't leave the sofa for their full 2-week booking, not even for a shower. They left a dent, a pretty bad smell, and a very confused Netflix queue. Then there was the person who flushed his late night kebab down the toilet with all of the wrapping. Now that doesn't sound like much, but the job to unblock this toilet was mine, and it was one of the worst jobs I've ever had to do. I'm not sure if it was just kebab down there. And then there was the person who brought their girlfriend to stay, and that bed did not stop squeaking for a week. All through the day and all through the night. Like I said, it could have been much, much worse. But honestly, I don't know how I did it. And I would be too terrified now to be a host. I also wouldn't... I think I would just like totally be on high alert at all times. And also I love my alone time. So I'm very happy keeping this second bedroom as a study and a studio right now. But make sure you keep watching these videos, that you subscribe, and that you share them so that this can be my backup plan instead of Airbnb having my future backup plan. I'm too old for that now. I'm sure that Nate and Brian would disagree. They're both a tiny bit older than me. Tiny. So before I get to the final summary, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that I didn't really know so much about in terms of being Airbnb, but I think says a lot about who they are and the principles that sit behind this business and that keep it going strong. So they've created a non-profit called Airbnb.org, and this provides emergency housing for displaced families. All donations go directly to covering the costs of the accommodation for those families, with Airbnb covering all operating costs. There is also an option for hosts to donate rooms for this as well. To date, 250,000 people have been housed in 135 countries, and that equates to 1.6 million free nights. Now, the Ukraine war was another example of Airbnb helping people who needed that help. Airbnb.org committed to providing free temporary housing to 100,000 people fleeing Ukraine. Although something Brian Chesky points out is that before they did anything formally as a business, individuals from around the world were already booking Airbnbs in Ukraine, even though they knew they couldn't stay there, just so those hosts would have some income coming in. To me, this says a lot of the type of business that it is and the values that it sits on. More about that in my summary in one moment. Now, there are cynical people amongst us that say any CSR activity is to counter bad publicity. But I'm an optimist and I believe in good people. And I think the driving force behind this is community and connection that's always been at the heart of Airbnb. Another example, in 2012, when Hurricane Sandy struck New York, an Airbnb host posted on Twitter to offer their Airbnb property free of charge for anybody who needed a place to stay. The co-founders saw the post and then quickly created a landing page so other people could do the same. In 24 hours, more than 1,000 people signed up. 1,000 people offering to house others for free. They did the same thing during the pandemic to offer safe accommodation for frontline workers, and Airbnb.org was actually born out of a lot of this activity that was in fact driven by the community. They also helped to provide housing for more than 34,000 Afghans when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan. So what have I learned from the Airbnb story? How to do a deck? No. I'm actually going to repeat something that I said in my last undercurrent video, or something very similar. In community, we find optimism. And I think there's 3 ways in which Airbnb have helped to create that community that then funnels the optimism that the team have. I want to talk about clear direction, about co-founders, this will be a recurring message, and about the importance of principles and the relation to design thinking. So let's start with clear direction. All along, the Airbnb team had clear goals. From trying to pay the rent within 2 weeks when they first started, to salvaging an IPO post-pandemic. Having clear direction is something that Brian has talked about a lot. He understands the need to focus on growth, especially in a business like Airbnb where there's network effects. But he does describe investor pressure that kind of just wants them to grow, but it doesn't really matter what direction, and he didn't like that. So it's like saying, he used the analogy of, it's like saying we need you to go at 60 miles an hour, but you don't really care which direction we go in at 60 miles an hour. Well, a couple of designers and a software engineer definitely did care the direction of growth. And clear direction is one of the reasons why Brian Chesky is often named as one of the greatest leaders of today. And this is coupled by his desire to create environments where people can do their best, but not, as he puts it, participation trophy best. He wants to give them clear goals, and by doing their best, they're going to help to hit those goals. I've heard him talk about micromanagement. He's done this in several different interviews, and he seems to kind of dismiss it slightly as a concept. But he also explains that early on, people need to understand what good looks like, and they may need some help in getting there. This is kind of a training phase, which if you do it badly, if you're not a good teacher, then it probably will feel like micromanagement to people, and they're probably going to be very put off and demotivated. But if it feels like training, giving them the skills they need and the clarity they need to do a good job, then ultimately they can take that and run with it. But he also recognizes that it's really dependent on the circumstances. In some scenarios, it is important for him as a founder to triple check a press release. He talks about believing in people and pushing them harder than they have ever been pushed before. And this gives people the satisfaction of achieving. It's definitely something that I've never really experienced in the workplace. I've only ever experienced this when I've been leading something myself or when I've been doing sports. He wants people to do more than they ever imagined they could. And this is pretty closely aligned to what I think my management and leadership style is. I think it's really important to be transparent about what's expected, to give people the tools they need to get there, and to be clear about the path you expect them to walk. And Airbnb has a 4.2 Glassdoor rating, so I think it's doing pretty well. So the other thing that worked is the co-founders. And again, I've got another quote from Brian Chesky, where he credits luck for a lot of his journey, as do so many kind of the more humble founders out there. But in particular, he credits the luck of meeting, knowing his co-founders. Given that 65% of the startups that fail do so because of co-founder relationships, and this stat was like actually a really shocking one to me and made me feel a lot better about my own circumstances, although it does make me feel more like a statistic. Relationships matter. Those co-founder relationships really matter. And all three of them stuck together at least till after the IPO. They went from not being able to pay the rent to being multi-billionaires as a team. And it didn't necessarily always come easy, but they did have one rule that worked, and this is something that you can take away. The rule was that winning an argument was never more important than preserving the relationship. And the reason it's important is because if you run a company, you're going to have to debate like 100,000 things. So no one argument can be the thing that breaks you apart, you know? There has to be this larger sense that we're a band. And then the final thing I want to talk about is the importance of values and principles. Now, right now, you will find the following core values on the Airbnb recruiting website. Champion the mission. We're united in partnership with our community to create connection, which enables belonging. Be a host. We're caring, open, and encouraging to everyone we work with. Embrace the adventure. We're driven by open curiosity, hopeful resilience, and the belief that every person can grow. Be a serial, with a C, entrepreneur. We're determined and creative in transforming our bold ambitions into reality. Now, these all look good and they look very aligned with what we know already about the Airbnb story, but of course, for values to have an impact, they have to actually match the behaviors that are described. Airbnb have consistently managed to tackle big problems and use it as a way to turn the ship around, which indicates that they do have strong values and that people are willing to come with them as they tackle those big problems. One of the things I'm taking away from this as well is their ability to swim against the tide. They are true disruptors. Because they have clear principles, they don't just get dragged along the same current as everybody else. One example is their work anywhere policy. When other companies were forcing people to come back into the office, Airbnb weren't. They had a caveat, it being you can work anywhere, but you have to work in a connected way and you must be able to come back to the office at regular periods. Honestly, not even joking, I spent some time looking at the jobs on the Airbnb site. At this point, I was like, this sounds fun. I mean, it reminded me that I also don't have very many corporate transferable skills. I'm much better in the startup and consultancy environment. Although it's no surprise that I might not thrive in a job that is currently posted on the Airbnb website, this is a business that is underpinned by principles that would work for me. So do we think Airbnb is Marmite? Do you love it? Do you hate it? What's my answer to that question? Well, what I've seen is that there's a lot of love and a lot of hate going around, but as always, there's a lot more nuance than that. Would I host an Airbnb again? No, I don't think so. Would I stay in an Airbnb again? Yes, maybe. Would I work for Airbnb? Absolutely 100% yes, if the right opportunity came up. Let me know if you love it or you hate it in the comments. So, for my final thoughts, specifically for founders, I want to share something that Brian said about compromise. Being a founder, it's very easy to think that you have to meet people halfway, but this doesn't help to lead you to where you are going. There is a nuance to be had, whereby you listen to other people, you work with their expertise, but don't compromise on the drive and the direction that you have. Let me know in the comments what you think about that. And if you've made it all the way to the end, then you're really gonna like what I have coming for you in 2026. So make sure that you like so that more people get to see these videos, and subscribe so you'll get the new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for sticking around. See you soon. Bye.